The Transfiguration, the unique event in which Jesus appears radiant in glory on the mountain alongside Moses and Elijah, is subtly described in the Synoptic Gospels Matthew, Mark, and Luke, mentioned in the Second Epistle of Peter, and according to some. Subtly alluded to in the Gospel of John, we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, John 1:14. John, along with Peter and James, was one of the 3 apostles who witnessed this miracle. This extraordinary gathering holds profound eschatological significance. Examining a single Greek word from the original text may help decode it, and that is what we will do in today's video. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to not miss any Bible-related content. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I pray that you receive many blessings from God. Amen. Let's start. The Transfiguration is considered one of the 5 key milestones of Jesus' life according to the Gospels, alongside the baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. It is a moment when Jesus' divine nature manifests through, or more precisely in his human nature, implying a foretaste of his glorified body, and thus foreshadowing the resurrection. Descriptions of the Transfiguration throughout history have served as a model for subsequent vibrant accounts of the resurrection, indicating that this passage can only be fully understood when viewed in the context of Jesus' death and his apparent failure in death. This passage should also be read allegorically, emphasizing that believers too need to be transformed through the action of the Holy Spirit. However, Jesus and these 3 apostles, John, Peter, and James, are not the only figures involved in this scene. What are Moses and Elijah doing here, talking with Jesus? Clearly, this is not a random occurrence. The appearance of Moses and Elijah at the Transfiguration is significant because they are connected in a particular way, and this connection reveals the meaning of the entire event. Nevertheless, there is no consensus on how Moses and Elijah are related to each other, leading to considerable disagreement on how their presence contributes to the Transfiguration. The view that Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets is widely supported. The argument for this interpretation can be summarized as follows: the law and the prophets serves as a shorthand for the scriptures of Israel, both in early Judaism and early Christianity. Moses is a fitting representative of the law because of his reputation as the one who received and recorded it. Elijah is a natural representative of the prophets because he is mentioned at the end of Malachi, the final book of the prophets, Malachi 4:5, and is remembered as one of the most significant prophets of the Old Testament, Sirach 48:111. Thus, Moses and Elijah function as representatives of the scriptures of Israel. Interpreting Moses and Elijah in this way can emphasize the continuity of Jesus and his teachings with the Old Testament and/or his supremacy over the law and the prophets. However, this perspective may be subject to criticism. Firstly, while Moses is an obvious choice to represent the law, he is also depicted as a prophet in the Old Testament, early Jewish literature, and the New Testament. If both Moses and Elijah are considered prophets, it complicates the notion of Elijah representing the prophets rather than Moses. Secondly, it is not immediately apparent why Elijah would be the natural representative of the prophets. Although he is a significant Old Testament prophet, he is not an author of prophetic books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, each of whom has a book named after them, would arguably be clearer representatives of the prophets. Thirdly, Moses and Elijah are not depicted as representatives of the law and the prophets elsewhere in early Judaism or the New Testament. Lastly, Mark mentions Elijah before Moses, Mark 9:4, which seems to suggest that the primary purpose of their mention is not to denote the law and the prophets, in which case they would be listed in a different order. Another argument is that Moses and Elijah appear together because both are eschatological figures. The book of Deuteronomy predicts a future prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18:15, 22, 34, 10, and it appears that this expectation was strong in the 1st century. As noted above, Malachi anticipates the return of Elijah, Malachi 4:5-6, and this expectation continued in early Judaism. A Jewish rabbinic tradition even speaks of Moses and Elijah appearing together in the end times, Deuteronomy 3:17. According to this view, Moses and Elijah could be seen as signifying the future coming of the Lord. The main issue with this view is that, according to Deuteronomy, it is not Moses himself who is expected to return, but a prophet like Moses. Mark further identifies Jesus as the prophet like Moses when he recounts the Lord's declaration, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him," Mark 9:7, emphasis added. This echoes Deuteronomy 18:15, where Israel is instructed to listen to the prophet like Moses when he appears. Thus, the primary motivation for considering Moses as an eschatological figure seems to stem from Deuteronomy 3:17. Another possibility is linking Moses and Elijah due to the extraordinary endings of their earthly lives. According to Deuteronomy, Moses died and was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day, Deuteronomy 34:5-6. Elijah, on the other hand, did not die but was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, 2 Kings 2:11-12. Thus, these two figures might represent different ends of life, providing contrasts to Jesus' resurrection. Alternatively, some Jewish traditions hold that Moses did not die, but like Enoch and Elijah, was taken up to heaven. According to this view, Moses and Elijah would have similar endings to their lives, providing a unique contrast to Jesus' resurrection. In either case, Moses and Elijah could be seen as heavenly figures, perhaps alluding to Jesus' heavenly origins chosen for their extraordinary life endings, which may highlight the uniqueness of Jesus' forthcoming resurrection. A weakness of this interpretation is that Moses and Elijah are not the only figures in the Old Testament with unusual endings to their lives. Enoch, for example, was also taken up to heaven, Genesis 5:24. So why does he not appear in the Transfiguration? The issue of Enoch's absence becomes more pronounced when we recognize that Elijah and Enoch appear together in Jewish literature, without Moses. Jewish traditions that connect Moses and Elijah due to their ascension to heaven also reference Enoch. There does not seem to be any text that links only Moses and Elijah due to their life endings. Therefore, this does not appear to be the primary reason Mark mentions Elijah and Moses. Other interpreters argue that Moses and Elijah appear in the Transfiguration because both had theophanies on Mount Sinai. For example, Irenaeus connects the presence of Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration to their theophanies on the mountain. Jewish tradition seems to have linked Moses and Elijah because of their similar experiences, especially their encounters with God on Mount Sinai, e.g. Sirach 45:5-48-7. Jesus, alongside Moses and Elijah, acts as a mediator between God and humanity, placing him in the company of those honored to meet God on Mount Sinai. Thus, Jesus' transfigured appearance shows him near the presence of God, similar to Moses in Exodus 34:29. The idea that Moses and Elijah appear together in the Transfiguration primarily because of their theophanies on Mount Sinai is compelling for two reasons. First, while other views have little or no basis in the Old Testament or early Jewish literature, this idea has some precedent in the Old Testament, as interpreted by both Sirach and Josephus. Second, the mountain context of the Transfiguration, which resonates with this view, is consistent with this stance. However, this view does not seem to have widespread support. The notion that Elijah and Moses appear in the Transfiguration, mainly due to their theophanies on Mount Sinai, would imply that the Transfiguration itself is a theophany. An aspect that has not received full scholarly attention is the theophanies of Moses in Exodus 33-34 and Elijah in 1 Kings 19, which exhibit similarities, suggesting that one story may have been modeled after the other. In addition to the common location of Sinai, Horeb, Exodus 34-1 Kings 19:8, four prominent similarities are noteworthy. Firstly, in each account, God passes by the prophet, Exodus 33:19, 22:34-6 1 Kings 19:11. Secondly, the prophet receives the theophany while in a cleft or cave in the rock. God promises to place Moses in the cleft of the rock as he passes by, Exodus 33:22. Elijah spends the night in a cave at Horeb and receives his theophany while standing at the entrance of the cave, 1 Kings 19:9-13. Thirdly, the prophet is shielded from God's presence. God promises to cover Moses with his hand until he is passed by, Exodus 33:22-23. Elijah covers his face with his cloak as he approaches the cave to meet God, 1 Kings 19:13. Fourthly, the prophet fasts for 40 days and 40 nights related to the theophany. Moses fasts while with YHWH on Mount Sinai, Exodus 34:28, compare Deuteronomy 9:18, 25:10-10. Elijah fasts on his journey to Horeb, 1 Kings 19:8. The similarities between these two theophanies are often noted. For instance, J.P. Hyatt comments on Exodus 33:21-23. The closest parallel to this theophany may be found in the account of Elijah's experience on Mount Horeb, 1 Kings 19:9-13. The result of this discussion is that the Old Testament itself provides valid reasons for relating Moses and Elijah as recipients of theophanies from God on Mount Sinai. The similarities in language and theme between Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19 encourage readers to relate Moses and Elijah due to their similar encounters with God on Mount Sinai. The idea that Moses and Elijah might be related through similar theophanies on Mount Sinai gains further plausibility when we recognize that Jewish interpreters have indeed connected Moses and Elijah for this reason. Jewish literature consistently lists 10 things that were created on the eve of the Sabbath during the week of creation. All these phenomena are thought to have appeared simultaneously in both the natural and supernatural realms, originating from the period between the completion of creation and the beginning of the Sabbath. One item that frequently appears in these lists is the cave where Moses and Elijah stood, or the cave of Moses and Elijah, since all the texts previously mentioned associate this cave with both Moses and Elijah. It seems likely that this is also the case here. Indeed, the fact that the author refers to the cave without further specification suggests that the concept of the cave of Moses and Elijah was sufficiently well known to not require additional information. The idea that Moses and Elijah received their theophanies on Sinai in the same cave also appears elsewhere in Rabbinic literature. In B. Meg, 19 billion late 6th century CER Hayya B. Abba is recorded as having said to R. Johanan, "If there were a hole no larger than the eye of a needle in the cave where Moses and Elijah stood, they would not be able to endure the light. As it is said, 'For man shall not see me and live.'" Similarly, the Jewish commentator Rashi in the 11th century identifies Elijah's cave as the cleft in the rock that Moses had occupied in his commentary on 1 Kings 19:9. The texts mentioned clearly identify the cleft where God hid Moses as he passed by Exodus 33:22 as the same location as the cave where Elijah stood when God passed by 1 Kings 19:13. Modern interpreters might question the validity of this interpretation. However, for our purposes, the issue is not whether these rabbinic authors are correct, but rather that they connected Moses and Elijah because of their theophanies on Sinai in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. Pisikta Rabbati 4.26 to 7th century CE also connects Moses and Elijah due to their similar theophanies on Mount Sinai. This passage includes a lengthy list of similarities between Moses and Elijah, some of which derive from Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. Regarding Moses and the Lord passed by before him, Exodus 34:6, and regarding Elijah, and behold, the Lord passed by 1 Kings 19:11. Moses hides in a cave, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, Exodus 33:22, and Elijah hides in a cave, spending the night there, and he came to a cave and lodged there, 1 Kings 19:9. Moses goes to Horeb, and Elijah goes to Horeb. Moses fasts for 40 days and 40 nights likewise. Elijah traveled for 40 days on the strength of that meal, 1 Kings 19:8. Here we do not identify the cave of Moses and Elijah as one and the same, unlike the rabbinic texts above. However, this text is important because it shows that at least one Jewish interpreter noticed the similarities between the theophanies of Moses and Elijah in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19, which modern Old Testament scholars have also observed. Indeed, it is suspected that such similarities led other Jewish interpreters to view the cave of Moses and Elijah as one and the same. The texts above demonstrate that many Jewish interpreters connected Moses and Elijah due to their theophanies in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. However, all these texts were compiled significantly later than the Synoptic Gospels. So how do they relate to understanding the significance of Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration? We do not intend to argue that these texts directly witness to the first-century view of Moses and Elijah, or that the Synoptic Gospel writers were aware of such traditions, though this may be the case. Instead, the logic of our argument should be as follows. The Old Testament itself provides substantial reasons for linking Moses and Elijah due to their similar theophanies in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. In fact, Jewish interpreters connected Moses and Elijah precisely for this reason. Therefore, it is highly plausible that Mark and other Synoptic Gospel writers linked Moses and Elijah for similar reasons, regardless of whether they were aware of these Jewish interpretive traditions. This conclusion is further reinforced when we recall that all other explanations proposed by scholars for the presence of Moses and Elijah at the Transfiguration lack or have minimal support in Jewish literature. In contrast, we have observed that a significant branch of Jewish interpretation, dating at least to the 3rd century CE, connected Moses and Elijah due to their similar theophanies in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. Thus, the idea that Moses and Elijah appeared together at the Transfiguration because of their similar theophanies has a much better precedent in the Old Testament and Jewish literature than any other explanation. If Moses and Elijah appeared at the Transfiguration due to the similar theophanies they received at Sinai in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19, this implies that the Transfiguration should be understood as a theophany that in some way evokes the earlier theophanies of Moses and Elijah. In fact, the Transfiguration story in Mark contains features that support such an interpretation. First, like the theophanies of Moses and Elijah, the Transfiguration occurs on a mountain, Mark 9:2. At first glance, this detail might seem insignificant, but note that no other interpretation of Moses and Elijah as representatives of the law and the prophets, eschatological figures, or individuals with unusual end-of-life events connects both characters with this context. In contrast, the mountain setting fits the context of the theophanies on Sinai from Moses and Elijah. Second, interpreters have noted several parallels between the Transfiguration and Moses' experiences at Sinai, the mention of 6 days, Mark 9:2 cf. Exodus 24:16, the three named companions of Jesus, Mark 9:2 cf. Exodus 24:1-9, the transformed and radiant appearance of Jesus, Mark 9:2-3 cf. Exodus 34:29-35, and the disciples' fear upon seeing Jesus' transfiguration, Mark 9:6, Exodus 34:30. These connections are often seen as portraying Jesus as a prophet like Moses, and Mark's reference to Deuteronomy 18:15 seems to confirm this. However, since Moses' experiences on Mount Sinai, which Mark references, were also theophanies, it seems that Mark intended for the Transfiguration to be read as a theophany as well. So what would it mean to read the Transfiguration as a theophany on a mountain reminiscent of the theophanies on Mount Sinai experienced by Moses and Elijah? Simply put, such a reading emphasizes the continuity between Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, like Moses and Elijah before him, is one who receives a theophany on a mountaintop. However, the Transfiguration resists such a reading in several ways. First, the divine voice from the cloud pales in comparison to the powerful and personal theophanies experienced by Moses and Elijah in Exodus 33-34 and 1 Kings 19. It would be unreasonable for Mark to prepare the reader for a theophany on a mountain in the style of Moses and Elijah and then deliver a far less profound experience of God's presence. Second, Mark presents the intended audience of the divine voice not as Jesus as one might expect if he were the recipient of the theophany, but rather as the disciples. The voice, in response to Peter's suggestion of making 3 tents for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, does not say, "You are my beloved son," as it does at Jesus' baptism, Mark 1:11, but rather, "This is my beloved son, listen to him." Mark 9:7. The plural pronoun implies that the audience includes not just Peter but also the other disciples. Third, God's voice clarifies that Jesus surpasses Moses and Elijah. While Peter implies that Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are on par, God emphasizes that Jesus, unlike Moses and Elijah, is his son. And when the disciples looked up, they saw only Jesus, Mark 9:8. But if the divine voice from the cloud is not the theophany being witnessed, then what is? We should understand that Mark presents Jesus as the personal presence of the God of Israel. As noted above, the transfiguration of Jesus seems to recall the radiance on Moses' face after he encountered God, Exodus 34:29-35. It is agreed that Moses' radiant face resulted from his encounter with God. He had seen God in a uniquely intimate way, and it could be said that God's glory had shone upon him. However, this is precisely where we see the difference between Moses' theophany and the Transfiguration. While Moses was transformed as a result of his encounter with God, Jesus was transfigured before the Father appeared or spoke. One might argue that Jesus was transfigured because of his contact with Moses and Elijah, heavenly figures, but this does not make sense since Mark describes Jesus' transfiguration before Moses and Elijah appear. Additionally, Moses' transfiguration through a uniquely intimate encounter with God shows that merely encountering a heavenly figure, like Moses or Elijah, would not suffice to achieve the transfiguration that Jesus experienced. Therefore, the divine glory radiating from Jesus in the Transfiguration seems not to be borrowed glory like that of Moses, but rather glory that Jesus himself possesses. Thus, Mark appears to present Jesus not as one who receives a theophany like Moses and Elijah, but as the one who himself constitutes the theophany. In other words, Jesus is the personal presence of the God of Israel. Moses and Elijah maintain their roles as recipients of a theophany, but they experience God's presence on this mountain in a way that surpasses their previous experiences at Sinai. Whereas Moses and Elijah could only see God with a veiled face before, now they see God face to face in the person of Jesus. In this context, it is understandable why Peter's suggestion to build 3 tents for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah is inappropriate. Peter is placing Jesus, the personal presence of the God of Israel, on the same level as the prophets who have seen him. As noted above, the divine voice from the cloud acknowledges that Jesus is the promised prophet like Moses. However, if Jesus were merely a prophet like Moses, Peter would not be mistaken in placing him on par with Moses and Elijah. Similarly, if Jesus were only the Son of God in the sense of being the Messiah, Peter's proposal might not warrant the divine response it receives. But if Jesus is the personal presence of the God of Israel, it is entirely fitting for God the Father to reject Peter's suggestion so bluntly, leaving only Jesus with the disciples. A potential objection to this interpretation is that the disciples do not seem to recognize Jesus as God during the Transfiguration, or for that matter, at any point before the end of Mark's Gospel. However, this objection loses its force when we recall that the second Gospel is renowned for the secrecy surrounding Jesus' identity, the so-called messianic secret. Indeed, Mark notes this secrecy immediately after the Transfiguration when Jesus commands Peter, James, and John not to tell anyone what they had seen, until the Son of Man had risen from the dead, Mark 9:9. A closely related phenomenon to this secrecy is the disciples' continual misunderstanding of Jesus' teachings and identity. Indeed, in some instances of misunderstanding, it could be argued that the disciples failed to recognize Jesus' divinity. For example, Richard Hayes argues that Jesus calming the storm, Mark 4:35-41, implies a divine Christology, as the ability to control wind and waves is a power that the Old Testament always ascribes to the Lord alone. Specifically, in Jonah 1:4-16, which Mark appears to model his story after, it is God who calms the storm. Thus, the disciples' question, "Who then is this?" that even the wind and the sea obey him, seems to imply that they have not grasped Jesus' divinity. Similarly, Hayes compellingly argues that Mark's account of Jesus walking on water, Mark 6:47-52, where Jesus intends to pass by the disciples, depicts God walking on the sea and passing by in an unclear manner. Mark concludes the story by noting the disciples' astonishment and hardness of heart, implying that they do not recognize Jesus' divinity. Thus, Mark provides ample precedent for the idea that Jesus is divine and the disciples do not perceive him as such. In this context, it is not surprising if Jesus reveals his divine glory and the disciples miss the main point. Therefore, when we interpret the Transfiguration as a theophany, it becomes clear that Jesus himself constitutes the theophany. The Transfiguration is the revelation of Jesus' own divine glory. Moses and Elijah, who had previously encountered God on a mountain in an intimate yet veiled manner, now encounter him directly in the person of Jesus. Thus, after extensive study, current research has explored why Moses and Elijah appear together at the Transfiguration, suggesting that these two prophets received similar divine revelations on Mount Sinai. This indicates that the Transfiguration should be understood as a divine revelation. Such an interpretation, if correct, is significant, as it adds to the growing body of evidence that Mark affirms a divine Christology presenting Jesus as the personal presence of the God of Israel. And if Mark portrays a divine Christology at the Transfiguration, it seems plausible that Matthew and Luke, generally considered to depend on Mark and retain relevant features of his Transfiguration story, might also hold a divine Christology. If you have truly watched this far, with God's blessing, please share it with your loved ones so they too can learn about this. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so we are motivated to create more Bible-related content. We hope to see you in the next video. May God bless and protect you always. Amen.